my hackles rise when anybody tells me the 2014 referendum was a gold standard. It most certainly was not. I don't think I've ever seen any democratic process ever with such a biased media. The media bias was absolutely overwhelming. It was, of course, overwhelming in the corporate media, but it's perhaps even more overwhelming in the state media, where the bias of the BBC was simply astonishing at times. And you may recall items like the Vote No Borders NGO that they devoted a 6-minute piece to, which was an entire invention. It actually literally did not exist. It was a PR stunt by Lord Offord. And they had a news item on it, which ran on every single BBC news all day for 6 minutes. And that's just one example of the kind of astonishing bias in the election and in the referendum, and the way that that referendum met no international standards and had no official international observers. It wasn't observed by the OSCE. If you're having a process like that, it is not any other country. It would be observed and is observed by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or by the United Nations, or by the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the OSCE. We didn't have any of those in place. That referendum was not a gold standard. It did not meet international standards. International standards are very important. And if I get one thing home to you, it is that independence is not a question of domestic law. Independence is purely a question of international law. Being an independent state is a state of being in relation to other independent states. Being an independent state is recognition by the United Nations. That is what independence is. It doesn't matter what your domestic legislation says. If you're not recognized by the United Nations, you're not independent. And it doesn't matter what Westminster says, and it does not matter what the Supreme Court says. If you are recognized by the United Nations, you are independent. It is not up to Westminster whether we are independent or not. And unless we get two fundamental things into our heads. And the first one is that the first referendum was not democratic, was fixed, was rigged, but not least by appalling media, and that the British state has no intention of ever giving us another referendum. Unless we get that into our heads, and unless we get into our heads that the Supreme Court in London is not our God, is not the judge of us, is not who we are accountable to, but the international community is who we have to convince. Unless we can grasp those two fundamental facts, we will never get anywhere. And this is where we have to accept something, and you all have to accept it. Because if you don't accept it, you're not really Scottish nationalists. You cannot believe two things. You cannot believe that the Scottish people have a right of self-determination, and you cannot believe that we are legally bound to accept a Westminster veto. You cannot, it is a logical impossibility to believe those two things at once. If you are prepared to accept a Westminster veto, and if you are willing to prepared to accept that the Supreme Court in London can stop us being independent by legal diktat, you're not actually a believer in Scottish independence. You're somebody who believes in bowing the knee to London. The right of self-determination is inalienable. You cannot sign it away. The final declaration of the Helsinki Agreement, to which the UK is a state party, states that a people always have the right of self-determination and always have the right to determine their form of governance, both internal and external. But that's Helsinki. In the Kosovo case at the United Nations, the British government, this is the British government's argument in the Kosovo case, the British government said that it is to be expected as a matter of course. Those were the exact words of the British government argument. As a matter of course, a declaration of independence will be illegal in the domestic law of the country where it is made. As a matter of course it will be. Of course it will be illegal for part of the country to unilaterally declare independence, but that does not prevent international recognition. That was the position of the United Kingdom government in the Kosovo case, and it's the correct position in international law. So what we have to do is two things. We have to recognize, in exactly the way Peter has been telling us, that ultimately we are going to have to declare and take our independence against the opposition of Westminster, and we're going to have to be prepared to do that in a way that is illegal in British UK law. And our Scottish government has to stop just being an administration on behalf of the London powers and has to actually show they mean it and declare independence and stick by it. And we then have to be prepared to physically face down the British powers on the street. You know, the day after you declare independence, you have to serve up oaths of allegiance to your senior police chiefs, to your judges, to your senior civil servants, make everyone take an oath of allegiance to an independent Scotland. And if they don't take the oath, you have to sack them instantly. You have to be prepared to stand in the street in front of tanks if they decide to send in the British Army to stop you. Because that's the only way it's going to happen. Anybody who believes that one day we're all just going to sit down and have a cup of tea and the British government is willing to let all our money and all our resources go is deluding themselves. That's never going to happen. And that's where we need to turn, having declared independence, having taken independence, we then need to turn to the international community for support. Now, what we're doing in Salvo and the Liberation Movement is we are establishing, in the eyes of the international community, that Scotland is a people who are being denied their right of self-determination like other colonised peoples. Now, I know a lot of Scots have difficulty with the idea of Scotland being a colony, and they tend to come from two sides. On one side, you have people whose sense of national pride is mortified by the idea we're a colony and thinks we have a proud historical tradition and we were never conquered and colonised. On the other side, you have the kind of left-leaning Marxist-y argument that actually we were terrible colonisers ourselves. We are dreadful full partners in the colonial project, and we owned slaves, and we went out and we killed people, and we're awful, terrible, terrible people who were fully complicit in the empire. Therefore, we can't be a colony. I don't think either of those views is correct. And the strange thing is nobody ever says either of those things about Ireland. And yet, constitutionally, our position is almost exactly the same as the Irish position was before the independence of the south of Ireland. Ireland had a treaty of union. Irish people served in a British army that went out and conquered the empire. Irish people owned slaves. But nobody says Ireland wasn't a colony. Why is it people can see it with Ireland and can't see it with Scotland, even with knowledge of the clearances, of the wars of independence? It always surprises me people don't see it. And we are still subject to colonial exploitation in so many ways. We have almost none of our exports leaving through our own ports. Almost everything we buy and sell comes in through England because the state routes our trade that way. Our natural resources, and particularly our energy, is all shipped down to England. Our electricity is shipped down to England, and then we pay them a fortune to give it back to us. We have vastly underdeveloped infrastructure. The infrastructure of particularly the west of Scotland is absolutely appalling. You try and get from Edinburgh to Wigton or somewhere like that, and it's ludicrous in this day and age. There is no other developed country I know. You compare it to much more difficult terrain, like the north of Italy in the Alps, for example, where there are tunnels and overpasses and bridges, all the things we just don't have. We have been deprived of usable infrastructure, and yet we're all the time being told that things like Crossrail in London are parts of national importance, and therefore part of that allocation has to be allocated to Scotland. We are ruthlessly exploited. And when you go to the United Nations and explain this to people, they get it. And one of the things that genuinely surprises me, absolutely shocks me, is that I've been going there now. We've only been at this since June. I first went to the UN in New York in June to start this. We've had 2 trips to New York and 1 trip to Geneva. I've spoken to people at ambassadorial level. This is where, frankly, where my personal background helps. And the United Kingdom is actually the only country in the world where former ambassadors don't get to keep the title ambassador. In every other country in the world, once you're an ambassador, you're always an ambassador, and you can style yourself an ambassador. Unfortunately, the United Kingdom is so unusual in that nobody realizes I can't style myself ambassador anymore. So I do. And I get in to see other ambassadors. And I've been talking to delegations at the UN, and I've talked to countries on the permanent 5 of the Security Council. I've spoken to African and Asian countries, I've spoken to Australasian companies, and I've spoken to European Union countries. And in not one instance have I encountered hostility or serious opposition. I haven't spoken to the Americans. I would probably encounter hostility and serious opposition there. But from nobody else have I encountered hostility and serious opposition, and extraordinarily, from particularly the Africans and the Caribbean nations, and if you like, the liberation countries of South America, they get it immediately. They absolutely take on board that Scotland was colonised and is still suffering the effects of that colonisation. And I was expecting pushback. I was thinking they would say, oh yes, but you had Scottish soldiers colonising us. No one has said that to me. That doesn't seem to be part of the thought process at all. So we are winning allies, and it is getting into the heads of people at the United Nations and into the heads of national delegations at the United Nations that Scottish independence is something which is on the horizon and coming. And most of them in the diplomatic community have no knowledge of that at all. You tell them that now the majority of opinion polls for the last year have shown a majority in favour of independence, and you tell them there's a huge majority in favour of independence amongst younger people. This is all news to them. The idea that this might be going to happen. And what absolutely fascinates them is the vast majority of countries in the world. There are 2 things about the vast majority of countries in the world. Firstly, the vast majority of countries in the world hate the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is actively complicit in the genocide in Gaza. That is understood. And secondly, the United Kingdom has cut, effectively in half, all its aid budgets. It has cut all its aid programs. It's cut its anti-malarial programs in Africa. It's cut its child education programs. And what people don't realise is where New Labour cut its aid budgets in half, the half that remains is mostly not aid at all. It's things where they're putting defence expenditure into the aid budget, saying security is a necessary precondition of development, for example. So the treasured programs and treasured assistance that people have been dependent upon, and which many people saw as a kind of, if you like, apology or unspoken reparation for colonial exploitation, has been cut. But those kind of decisions which the Labour government makes come home to roost. They make you very unpopular. Brexit made the UK extremely unpopular among the Europeans, so there's no automatic support from them. So you're pushing at an open door. You really are pushing at an open door. I've been made very welcome. I've been given so much alcohol by various diplomatic representatives that I'm surprised I'm still standing. It's really been, it's been great fun to do. The second point of it is, if you can achieve listing as a non-self-governing territory, and I should say, people understand, people are not stupid. Indian diplomats understand that India was conquered by Indian soldiers in the service of the British. So they don't take the view, because they were Scottish soldiers, they couldn't have been colonised. Colonised people know that the way colonialism works, the way imperialism works, is to co-opt the colonised people into your armies, and people understand that is what happened to Scotland. That is not a difficult point to get over to people. If we can achieve listing as a non-self-governing territory, which you do through the Committee of 24 and the General Assembly, and in which the Security Council has no part, then there's an immediate obligation on the host country to decolonize. That, if you like, preempts Security Council intervention. And the other thing, which is very, very important, is that the large majority of countries at the United Nations are sick to their teeth of the structure of the United Nations, of the fact that the Permanent Five have a veto, of the fact that the Americans have vetoed, 12 now resolutions on Gaza, for example, that the current structure of the United Nations prevents the United Nations from working properly. And I think everyone does understand that. The Americans are happy because they want to prevent it from working properly. And to some extent, I think that's true of the United Kingdom as well. But people do understand, and this is very, very important at the UN, that if you split up the United Kingdom, it would be no means necessary that the United Nations should accept the United Kingdom as England as the successor state of the United Kingdom. There are many ways that could be blocked. In fact, I discussed with the Russian ambassador to the United Nations the hurdles Russia had to go through at the UN in order to be recognized as a successor state. And he said it's extraordinary they succeeded in the sense because the hurdles are so great. And if anybody wanted, it was only because there was so much goodwill by the whole international community that it got through. But if any state wanted to block England from being recognized as the successor state, it would be very simple to do so. And that would open up the whole question of the structure of the United Nations, because one of your permanent five would have disappeared. And opening up the whole structure of the United Nations is something which delegations to the United Nations are desperate to do. So, this is not easy. I'm not certain we will succeed. It's going better than I expected. When I started off, I thought we would take 3 to 4 years to get to a position where we're getting the Committee of 24 to make a decision on whether or not to recommend us as a non-self-governing territory to the General Assembly. And I think that timetable is probably slightly shortened. The British and the Americans have only just woken up to the fact we're doing it and are now starting to lobby hard against it. But whether it succeeds or not, what it is doing is it's putting in the mind of the international diplomatic community that a decision on Scottish independence is coming. And it may not come from a route that I've outlined. This may not work. It's worth a go. I'm not saying to you, yes, I'm 100% certain it will work. I'm not. It's an extremely difficult thing we are undertaking. But what it has done is win us an enormous amount of allies and an enormous amount of goodwill and an enormous amount of thinking about Scottish independence from countries, particularly in places like South America and Africa, from countries who had never thought about Scottish independence before. So that is the point of the international route. That is what we are doing with Salvo and Liberation. And I finish where I started, if you like, but the purpose of it is that nobody is going to give us independence. We're going to have eventually to take independence. And we are then going to have to get support of the international community. And we've been, I include myself in this, we've all been, the movement has been reticent, the movement has too long delayed reaching out to the international community and seeking that support. And actually, in a way, the Committee of 24 non-self-governing territory route is kind of the mechanism, the path that allows you to seek that support, which may be useful in a wider way. And I should finally say that I'm only, if you like, the front man at the UN because of my diplomatic background. All of the work has been done by some tremendous people. None of the work really has been done by me. All of the background work has been done by Sarah Saliers and her team, by Liberation and Salvo. And Jeff Bush I saw here as one of them. There are probably others here today. People have put in a tremendous amount of work into this. And I think it gives me great hope that the independence movement has a great deal of life in it when other routes seem blocked. And I do urge you all to get behind and support the effort. Thank you very much indeed.